Since one is bound to get lost with me explaining my process and the mistakes I made, I will start answering why I created this space machine. In summary, it was simply to get more people able to understand 8-bit arithmetics using curiosity opposed to the force of pen and paper. So, before going too deep into 4-bit memories and calculating machines, I just want to explain that the prototype was made for Christmas to explain the principles behind RGB pixels to my 7-year-old niece, and to give her a fundamental understanding of number bases and binary arithmetics. However, my 3-year-old nephew was more interested, so it quickly became obvious that the prototype was not robust enough, both because the panel mount and loose wires, like these. The deadline and prototype was however important, since it taught me to the power of Schmidt-triggered OR gates if one forgets pull-down resistors in your breakaway board. So realizing the need to distract my nephew with a more robust version of the prototype, I made revision 0 for his birthday. But it was not stable enough, due to lack of resistors on the data and clock lines. I therefore created a revision 1 that works well enough. I will over the coming month show the details on assembling revision 1 and usage of associated 3D printed parts and holders and tools. But this video will try to explain how I went from a 64-bit memory with thoughts of making 4-bit calculators and arithmetic machines to instead pivoting towards learning PCB design and making this space machine. So how did I get from this 64-bit memory to this, as my 3-year-old nephew would describe, space machine? Well, firstly, my curiosity got the better of me, and I wanted to understand why somebody made this pedagogical tool. So I repaired one that had lost some wires, because there is a lot of wires, loose wires. And I realized it was great at explaining how memory works. It was not only great at explaining how memory works, it was also great at explaining 4-bit logic. Like the first question I thought to myself was basically 64-bit memory, but it only uses 4-bit inputs and 4-bit memory address inputs. Well, as I realized after a well-needed nights of sleep, was that 4-bit data word times 2 raised by 4 gave 16 memory locations able to store 4 bits each. Multiplying 16 and 4, and I need my calculator for that, because who needs arithmetics? So 16, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then times 1, 2, 3, 4 gives 64. So it is 64-bit memory. This of course made me interested in making a 4-bit calculator to understand and demonstrate how these extremely lightweight, agile and flexible mechanical calculators became obsolete in less than a decade following the introduction of the 4-bit Intel 4004. After another nights of sleep, I asked myself, Who benefits from these experiments and questions? Realizing nobody wants to listen to me rambling about 4-bit CPUs, I asked myself another question. How do I get people to challenge my thinking in the field of technology so I can sleep less and act more? The obvious answer was, at the time, young people. Given I have a number of nephews and nieces, I have enough curious people to challenge my thinking. After another night of sleep, I came to another realization, based on the fact that one of the reasons I remember my grandfather so profoundly was because he taught me about water wheels and physics. This was followed by another realization, namely one that I would have benefited more from learning about turbines and generators than about water wheels. These 3 days of reasoning and realizations caused me to shift focus from learning about 4-bit calculators and instead shift focus towards engaging my 7-year-old niece in digital logic and circuitry. So to summarize this far, I had come to the realization that in order to actually get my 7-year-old niece hooked on the drug that is programming and electronics, I ought to do something more engaging than a badly optimized 4-bit calculator. I also had came to the conclusion that for 4-bit input and 4-bit memory addresses gives 64 bits, as realized by multiplying 16 with 16 memory locations with, wait, I just need to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, yeah. Which just gives 64. If I just get enough brightness. It does say 64. Resetting it. I will not do any more math today, so I will remove that out of sight and continue with the video. So, after abandoning the world of mathematics, I instead chose to make something more interesting. So I can take away my memory board and unplug it so I don't get a dead short accidentally while demonstrating. So I took one of the memory boards, as evident by here, and soldered some wires going from the board's tracks to this breakaway board, hoping I could connect an ESP32 to it. But since I forgot about the pull-down resistors, and this being November with a deadline of Christmas, I abandoned the ESP32 for an Arduino Uno that proved to be more robust. I then decided to put some Smith-triggered OR gates in place of the pull-down resistors. Yeah, it is hard to see. It's for wait, 1, 2, 3, yeah, 3 quad OR gates, and it's not my proudest moment. But I am happy for the experience of understanding the importance of Smith triggers and pull down resistors. It highlights how far I've come in 3 months. And someday I would love to dive deeper into the stupidity of me in November, December of 2023 and this RGB prototype. But this is not the day or video for that. Just know it has 2 ATmegas, 1, 2, reading from UART transmitted from the board behind the scenes here. Again, yeah, it is the last IC is a ATmega reading from the switches and the Smith triggers. I mean, yeah, from the switches and button and the breakaway board that reads from some of the switches. Right, that was the one that had broken. Yeah. Having 3 ATmegas is not optimal for this purpose. It is overcomplicated, but it was quick, and it proved that the prototype was possible to build upon. And understanding that I am able to read from the UART and read switches and transmit the switch data to the display will prove handy for PCB revision 0. Anyways, so somehow I managed to deliver this working prototype by Christmas of 2023. The response from the 7-year-old was care for curiosity, which is extremely healthy response when one sees this rat's nest. Yeah, calling it a rat's nest is so before I cut the video, I got carried away by realizing how calling it a rat's nest would be rude to the rats. But yeah, the 7-year-old was hesitant to the safety of this, which is a proof that her grandfather, who is an electrician, has taught her very well. But before I could start explaining that to her that 5 volts is pretty safe and shift focus from safety to RGB, pixels and binary logic, her 3-year-old brother exclaimed with starry eyes, "Space machine!" And this space machine, yeah, it caused me to laugh. So before I could stop myself from laughing and rolling on the floor, 2 of these loose switches had lost its soldered connection, which isn't strange, because I had only fixed 2 of them. And I realized it would be better to redesign this prototype in a more robust manner. So when I returned to the concept after Christmas, I asked myself 2 questions. 1, can I make a more solid connection of the switches to the board? I answered this with the conclusion that I needed to look into designing a PCB to hold the switches and connections. Question 2 I asked was, can I reduce the amount of microcontrol units? And the answer to that question turned out to be shift registers. So before starting to explain the timeline of the consequences of the decisions to make a custom PCB, I brought out the revision 0, that is the earlier PCB than revision 1. And to not give anyone epileptic seizure, I will black out the displaying for the meanwhile. So a quick line of the consequences of the decisions to make a custom PCB was me finding the open source electronic design software KiCad and look to see if it had footprints for the switches. It did not, and I later had to edit the ones similar to the ones I had. Same story as the switches was the story of the 7 segment displays footprints. But that is a later story that will also be mentioned in my GitHub documentation. So the next step after setting the constraints for the next version of the concept was, like mentioned, to find footprints. After feeling confident that the footprints was available and that this path of learning PCB design shouldn't be an impossible one, I decided to order some shift registers to test that the order of the pins on the shift registers logically corresponded against the pins of the 7-segment displays. An interesting finding here is that naming conventions is usually very logical in engineering. A through age is equal to 0 through 7. So in the experiments I conducted before designing and ordering the PCB, I had not tested SPI as a protocol. Since I just used a random library and trusted it would not require me to do any thinking, this assumption was a mistake, as can be seen by... I don't want to look at it. However, the mistake of not diving into SPI was more understandable than the missing pull-down resistors. The reason for the lack of experiments was that I had a tight deadline between Christmas and my 3-year-old nephew's birthday in the beginning of February. I have probably forgotten to highlight my agile shift in target groups, switching from a responsible 7-year-old to an impulsive 3-year-old. This was a logical pivot following their first exposure to the stakeholders, showing me that I could never get the piece to engage the hesitant 7-year-old while her brother loved the flashing lights. I therefore decided to make one for each of my siblings' children and one for myself for demonstrations and getting peace to demonstrate. And I needed to make this at least robust enough to survive a week with a 3-year-old. Long story short, 1 week before my nephew's birthday party, I received this PCB. Soldering it together took 1 day, or 3 p.m. to 3 a.m. with the first test at 2 a.m. not. It didn't work at all. Troubleshooting with an oscilloscope the next morning made it actually light up. However, it's slightly blinking in its nature. It's still blinking. I realized why it suddenly worked was because the probe connected to the USB oscilloscope acted like a 1 mega ohm pull-down resistor. So I added a 100 kilo ohm pull-down resistor to both the clock and data line, and it worked well enough. Questionable. But this was the day before my nephew's birthday party. So I decided to scrap the most flaky of the registers. The ones for the 74165 for the switches. I took those and put on ATmega in the back here. Oh, the focus is not great. Yeah, so I put some screw terminals and pulled it out to the ATmega. And transmit over UART. So I managed to finish this PCB, revision 0 for my nephew's birthday. But seeing this, I can try to zoom without needing to cut again, maybe. I will attempt at least. So yeah, and if I increase the shutter speed, it would be even more obvious that this isn't very nice. Seeing this flashing, I decided not to gift it to him, as I would have taken it as a personal insult receiving it. But the flashing inspired me to implement this new feature of Blackout. So yeah. The Blackout feature uses the extra switch I added to support a future mode of reading from serial UART and display the binary, hexadecimal and decimal representation of this transmission. But since I doubt that functionally being something I will use or implement this year, since even if I find the time to teach them about ASCII, I doubt I would really need to transmit the value back to the transmitter. So instead of reading from serial, I want this to sort of be able to work as a night lamp without the distraction of the displays. This ability to be used as a night lamp was also the reason I have both RGB 1. In this one it's RGB 2 and RGB 1 somewhere. Yeah, it doesn't matter where it is, but it is 2 screw terminals so you can have 2 different RGB strips. And yeah, it's even if you have a separate 5 meter long RGB strip, it's good to be able to turn off the display. So to circle back, realizing that giving my 3-year-old nephew epilepsy would have been considered rude, I brought the board for some troubleshooting. After nearly a week of troubleshooting and searching, I tested with serial resistors on the data lines using a solderless breadboard. I felt like I noticed noticeably less crosstalk between the wires going out from the solderless breadboard to a minimalistic version of the revision 0. I will need to get that one. So I found this board that I used to attach some DuPont wires to the headers. And yeah, that's how after some troubleshooting I realized that what I read online about pull-down resistors not being needed on SPI lines, and instead they use for the serial resistors. At this point, when after troubleshooting the PCB, I was starting to feel delusional and stupid, so I included room for a filter and pull-down resistors on this board, the revision 1. But I didn't need the filter or pull-down resistors. I will back out this and talk about revision 1. After receiving revision 1, I tested with some jumpers instead of the resistors. And the jumpers were pure copper wire as a 0 ohm resistor. This was as noisy or possibly noisier than revision 0, since there was no pull-down resistor. Yeah, when using that one. It definitely was noisier because I had to touch the copper to get it working. I then decided to go to the highest typical value for series termination resistors on SPA lines, namely 51 to 56 ohm. The 51 to 56 ohms resistors worked splendidly, since at this point I was near giving up and just ordering a revision 2 with 3 MCUs. instead of the shift registers. So seeing it work using shift registers was really rewarding. So the less epileptic version 1. It has, except the fact that it is less likely to cause epilepsy, it also has a little bit wider spacing between the switches. Realizing this video has already become very long, I will end the video here, and promise a follow-up to demonstrate how I intend to present this and binary arithmetics year after year, until people either grow sick of me or find binary the most logical of number bases. When editing, I realized that I should give a sneak peek at the counting, but mostly the version I will actually gift to my nephews and niece. Since it is now different number bases, I wanted it more obvious, so I will use blue, green and red. And this version uses 33 ohm instead of 51 ohm on the SPI lines. It also uses a 220 ohm current limiting resistor instead of the 330 ohm. And this will also improve 3D printed holders for 12mm plywood. I will cover all of this in a later video. I will also end the video with me flipping the most significant nibble to F and the least significant nibble to 3, because I doubt I will find time to present its full capability in any other language than Swedish. So basically, yeah, to me it is pretty obvious the correlation between binary and hexadecimal here doing this.